Hi, my name's Justin Shelf, and I'm the engineering lead at PatchMyPC. We develop a solution to allow you to easily integrate third-party updates into SCCM. Prior to that, I was also a senior premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting SCCM. In this video, we're going to be talking about internet-based client management, some of the things that you need to know about it, and how we can set it up. Before we get started, this is a rather complex topic, probably one of the hardest feature areas to set up within SCCM. So I think it's important to really understand some of the prereqs that we need to have in place. And a lot of these are actually outside of Config Manager itself, some external things that we need to have. So the first thing that we need is a public DNS name. So when our clients are out on the internet, we need to have a public DNS name that's going to route back to our site. So I've already configured this. What I'll be using today is IBCM.setupconfigmanager.com. So that's going to be pointing back to my lab. The next thing we need is a PKI setup. So if you haven't watched my previous video right before this one, we actually did a step-by-step guide on how you can configure and install Active Directory certificate services, which will allow you to have the PKI infrastructure. We also go through the process of creating the templates that we need for SCCM. So this would include the client, distribution point, and the IIS certificate that we need. So that whole video would be something that you would want to check out before this if you don't have your SCCM site configured for HTTPS. We do need to have trust between our site system that will be hosting our internet-facing site system roles and our clients. So if your site system is part of the same domain and it's trusted and you're issuing them from the same certificate authority, that's just going to happen by default. This can come into play if you're using a untrusted domain, for example, for your site system that will be hosting those internet-facing site system roles for your clients. If it's untrusted, you would have to make sure that you either issue the certificate for the web server that's going to be hosting that from your internal domain that clients trust, or you could possibly use a third-party trusted web server certificate because your client should also trust that as well. Now, there is no requirement that you have to use a Microsoft Active Directory certificate services, but it is going to make issuing certificates to your clients and your web servers and renewing them much easier. So that would probably be the best way to go in most scenarios. Obviously, internet connectivity from our clients, we're going to need that in order to connect back to our site. The ports, so this can be a big one. If you are using a DMZ for your site system that's going to be facing the internet, you're going to have to make sure you have the necessary ports for your site server to connect into that site system and for that site system to connect back to your database. So I do have a separate blog post that will go in detail all the ports that we need and the way that those ports would have to be configured. So that's going to be important to check out if you are using a DMZ for your internet-facing MP, DP, and sub. And the site system that's going to be hosting these does have to be domain joined. So like I mentioned, it could be in an untrusted domain in a DMZ, but it does have to be in a domain. It can't be a work group. Now, if you do use an untrusted domain, there are some things that can come into play with certificate revocation checking. So within the blog post I'll link out for the prereqs, I will talk about this. But essentially what would happen is if you have a site system in a DMZ, you would have to make sure that the certificate revocation list for the certificate we issue is accessible. So for example, say that you created a web server certificate on your internal Active Directory domain, you allowed the private key to be exported, and then we used that on the DMZ in the untrusted forest. We would have to make sure that we could check those certificate revocation list unless you disable that feature, which obviously wouldn't be a best practice because you couldn't see if the client certificates checking in are revoked. In order to do that, the default option is just an LDAP query. So what we would have to do if you are using Active Directory certificate services is to configure what's called a HTTP certificate revocation list distribution point. It's actually quite easy to do, but that would just allow us to use an HTTP path like we can see here. I will link out to one of the Config Manager product group blogs that does talk about how you can configure that so that DMZ server in the untrusted domain could still check whether client certificates are revoked or not. And the other thing that's going to be important is how we're configuring our connection to come to our site server. So I'm actually going to jump over to the internet-based client management Microsoft Doc website, and there's going to be an option here that talks about the different options. While I'm on this page, there are some features that aren't supported, so things obviously like Wake on LAN, operating system deployment, remote control would not be supported there for internet-facing clients. This documentation does also talk about the untrusted forest scenario where user policy would not work because there's no trust to do those lookups. But here's what I want to talk about. This is really going to be most likely handled by your security team. Generally, this falls outside of the scope of the SCCM admin, but there are essentially two different ways that we can route traffic to our site that would be supported by Config Manager. One is going to be SSL bridging, so that's the most secure option. Essentially what would happen there is your client would send the connection to that public-facing DNS name, and then there would be a bridging server. So this could be something like TMG, Threat Management Gateway, but that's actually going out of support very soon by Microsoft. It could be something like an F5 server. But basically what bridging does is the service that's implementing that bridging can basically take that client communication, inspect it, close the connection, and then create a new connection back to your server. So it allows you to do things like inspecting the traffic for different type of exploits that would be known about it. So that's going to be the most secure option, but it is a bit more complex to get set up. And then there's a tunneling option, which is where we basically just ensure that the traffic coming from our internet clients is using a valid certificate, and then we just kind of forward that along to your site system. That's going to be what I'm using in this video. I have used TMG in the past. That does require Server 2008, and it's actually going out of support soon, so that probably wouldn't be the best method to use if you did want to go with the bridging option. But what I'm doing in my lab, just to kind of show you what that's going to look like, is on my router, I'm going to just forward HTTPS traffic coming in from the internet. So we're going to do port 443, and I'm going to forward that to my site system that's going to be hosting my roles. So let me just grab the IP address of that. We'll paste that in. And it's also going to be port 443 on the internal server that we're going to be listening on. So I'll configure that and then apply that. So that's pretty much all the considerations that you would have to think about even before we start adding any type of site system role in SCCM. So what I'm going to do is I have a new server called SCCM-IBCM. So I'm running a standalone primary site. Right now, I just have one site system. That is my site system running on my site server. So nothing too complex. This is actually coming right from our install guide, and then our basic config, and then HTTPS guide is where we're at right now. So jumping over to my domain controller, if you remember in the previous video, if you haven't watched that, you're going to want to start there. We created the SCCM IIS certificate template. We gave a security group called SCCM IIS servers permissions to enroll. So what we're going to do, we're going to come in and add the computer account of our new server to add it to that group so we can enroll the certificate. In order for that change to take effect on the server side, we do have to restart that. Otherwise, we would get denied when we come in and request that certificate. Now, while we're on the domain controller and the certificate authority, I will show you what we could do if we did have a certificate that we wanted to issue to a server that is in an untrusted forest. What we could do here is duplicate the IIS certificate that we created, and then we could just name this something like SCCM IIS certificate dash DMZ. What we would do in this case, under the request handling, we would allow the private key to be exported. And then what we would do is we would request this on a computer that is part of the domain. So this could be your site server, for example. And then we could export it with the private key. We would just have to make sure that for the DNS names, we give it the name of that DMZ server and then the public domain for your internet-facing domain name. And we'll go through that process. But that's what that would look like. We'd come in here and give the SCCM IS group read and enroll permissions, and then OK. And then we could request that, export it, and then use that on our server. All right, so that site system that we're going to use to install our internet-facing roles on, that did reboot. So what we're going to do, we're going to come in and go to our certificate snap-in. We're going to choose the computer account, local computer, and then finish, and then OK. So just like we did when we switched our site over to HTTPS in the first video, we're going to come in here and we are going to request a certificate. We're going to choose the SCCM IS certificate. And then we're going to choose the alternative name and the DNS name. So this is where we're going to add the DNS name of our server. So this is going to be SCCM-IBCM. So that's going to be just the host name. We're then going to add the internal fully qualified domain name. So that's going to be the hostname.contoso.local. And then we want to add that public DNS name that we are going to use for our internet-facing clients. So let me just copy that. And I'm just going to ping that to make sure that I got that correct and we have that public IP. So that looks good. Then what we're going to do is give it a friendly name. I'll just call this SCCM IBCM MPCERT. And then OK, and then enroll. Now, one thing I'm noticing is we don't have any client certificate on this machine. That's because back in our lab, we only configured the auto enrollment domain policy for the OU for our testing lab for this site. So what I'm going to do is move that server to that OU. And then let me come over here and run a GP update /force. So we will need the client cert in order for us to successfully check whether the management point is up and running because it will require authentication. So we can see that that certificate did auto enroll now that we're in that OU. So we can see that client cert template did get issued and enroll on that machine. Now that we have our web server certificate, we can come into IIS and come to our websites. And you're going to see here we have two websites. Now I did pre-install WSUS, but I do cover this in the first video for installing SCCM. So if you did want to walk through that, it's basically just installing the WSUS role. So we do have the two websites here. Now what we want to do is under the default website, we want to edit the bindings. And then we're going to add our HTTPS binding and then choose that IBCM certificate. So that should be good here. So if we close that and if we open a web browser, what we should be able to do is browse out to HTTPS SCCM-IBCM, and we can see the certificate is now valid, and we can also verify the fully qualified internal domain name. It should be working there too, and it should probably be able to work on our public name now too, if that's resolvable. It looked like it was. So we can see it's also working using that public name as well. So that can just kind of verify that we are up and running in IIS and our certificate is configured. Now the next thing that we're going to do is configure our WSUS server to use the same website as the default website. Now usually with Server 2012 and newer, WSUS does by default install on a separate website, so it uses port 8530 and 8531. Now, this is going to be best practice generally because it's going to split up your default website, which would be running things like the management point, distribution point, any other IIS site systems in SCCM. It would separate that out so it's easier to troubleshoot because we would have a different IIS log for WSUS and the other component. But when we're talking about IBCM, it's pretty common that you would want to open as few ports as possible. So what we were going to do here is switch our WSUS server to use 443 instead of 8531. So instead of opening up the 2 ports, we can now just use the 1 port for port 443. So in order to do that, I am going to bring up one of the guides here about how to switch WSUS to only use SSL. So I will link to this in the notes. But what we're going to do, we're going to come into our website for WSUS. Under the API remoting folder, we're going to click the SSL settings, and we need to make sure that's set to require certificate. Or I'm sorry, require SSL. We want the client cert to be set to ignore. We're then going to repeat that for the client web service, the DSS auth service, the simple sync, and the simple auth. So we want to make sure we set those 5 directories to require SSL. Once we do that, we can then come into our WSUS utility. So I'm going to come over here. We're going to cd to program files, update services, tools, and within the tools folder, there's going to be a tool called WSUS util. So we are going to run a WSUS util command, and then we want to, actually before I switch over to SSL, what we need to do is run the use custom website option. So we're going to run WSUS util, use custom website equals false. So what that's going to do is it's going to move our WSUS from using this custom website. We can see that it looks like it's already gone. And it's going to start moving those directories over to the default website. So it looks like that did switch over. Now let me just check these folders. So it looks like that did reset my configurations. So you're probably going to want to run this command first if you haven't already configured the require SSL option, because I'm going to have to come back in here real quick and just configure all these directories back to using SSL. Okay. And then the last one for the auth service. So now that we're on the default website and we have those directories configured, if we come back to the WSUS util, we're going to run another command. So up here, there's going to be a configure SSL option. So let me copy that. We're going to run WSUS util configure SSL, and then we're going to enter the fully qualified internal domain name of our server. So there's going to be SCCM-IBCM.contoso.local. What that command is going to do, we can see it was successful, is it's going to switch WSUS to only use port 443. So that looks good. And we'll just make sure our certificate should still be binded. Let me just make sure it all looks good because we did move that. So that looks good. So we're all set here for our IIS requirements for the cert, as well as WSUS being ready for us to install on our software update point. So the next thing that I'm going to do is add the computer account of our site server to the local administrators group on this remote site system we're going to use for our internet-facing site system roles. Okay. So this is going to allow the server for our site server to connect in and install the new site systems for our MP, DP, and SUP that I'm going to install on this machine. Now within the install wizard, you can use a service account if you wanted. If you're using a untrusted forest, in fact, you're going to have to use a service account for that untrusted domain to connect in to configure that. But since I'm in the same domain, I'm just going to make sure my computer account for my site server has local admin rights on my IBCM site system that I'm going to install. Right. So what I've done, I do want to show that I did copy the no SMS on drive to my C drive, and then I have a content folder where all the site system components are going to get installed. So that no SMS on drive, that just tells SCCM that we don't want to install any content folders for SCCM on this drive. So back on my primary site, what I'm going to do here is under servers and site system roles, I'm going to create a new site system server. We're going to go ahead and browse out to my computer for SCCM-IBCM. So that looks good. If this was an untrusted domain, you would just type in the fully qualified domain name. We're going to install this for our primary site. Now this option is important. We do need to specify the FQDN for use on the internet. So this is going to be that ibcm.setupconfigmgr.com. I do just want to copy that, and we'll run a quick ping command because I would not want to typo on that. And it looks like that looks good. The next thing, there is an option here to require the site server to initiate connections to the site system for doing things like copying inventory files. That could just reduce the number of ports. So the site server would always initiate communication to get information about things like inventory and things like that. In my case, I don't have a DMZ and I'm not worried about ports. So we can just have that site system for the internet facing roles, just send the files up to our site system through the normal, our site server through the normal flow. Here's the site installation account. So we configured our computer account to have local admin rights. So I'm just going to use the site server computer account. But if you did want to use a service account, or if you were in an untrusted domain for your DMZ server or your site system for IBCM, you would have to define an account in that other domain that would have local admin rights on that computer. So I don't have a proxy, so I'm not worried about that. What I'm going to do, initially, I'm just going to install the software update point because that takes the longest amount of time to get configured, because we do have to synchronize our updates in order for our internet clients to actually be configured to use that. So that can take a little bit to get that first catalog sync done. So we'll come back and do the MP and DP after we get this configured. So for WSUS, we are going to be using port 80 and 443 because we did switch that WSUS server to use that. Now, by default, if you're using Windows Server 2012 or above, like I mentioned, the default port would be 8530. But since we set that over, we're going to keep that. And then we are going to require SSL because we did configure our WSUS server to require that. Now, Cloud Management Gateway, we'll probably talk about this in another video. This is similar to IBCM, but your components are going to run in Azure, and then that's going to sync onto your site. So it's kind of like IBCM, but you're hosting out those site systems that your clients talk to out in Azure. So it's a little bit easier to get set up. You don't have to worry about DMZs and things like that. Now, in my case, I'm only going to allow intranet-only clients to connect against this software update point. You could also allow intranet clients if you wanted to, but in my case, I'm going to install this site system so that it would only be used for internet clients. So what we're going to do on the back end, we just want to make sure that that installs successfully. This becomes especially important if you're doing things like a DMZ, where it's pretty likely if you don't have ports open, the first attempt that you try this might fail. So what we're going to look at is the CcmMessaging.log on our site server. So this is the site component manager. This is going to show us copying files and installing the SMS executive service to that remote machine. So we can see it's now copying all the files to the admin $ and starting to install that service. So if we look over on that machine, so I'm going to browse out to SCCM-IBCM \D$ because that's going to be the drive that it gets installed on. So there's going to be some log files that come in soon. It doesn't look like we're quite there where we're installing the components yet, but that should happen soon. All right, so we can see that we just installed the WSUS component for our software update point. So if we come back to our logs folder, we should now have the SupSetup.log. So this is the log that would be running on our remote site system that we're using. And we just want to make sure that the installation was successful. Now, more importantly, that install almost always is successful. What we're really worried about here is the WSUS control.log. We want to make sure that we can successfully connect to the WSUS server on that remote system that we're installing, and that we can successfully configure it. So we can see that we did successfully connect and configure it to basically be a downstream server of our main software update point. So now what I'm going to do, just to get that initial catalog syncing, we're going to go ahead and kick off a software update point sync on my primary. And I'm just going to jump over to my site server logs on my primary and then review the WSync-Manager.log. All right, so we can see if we scroll up a little bit, our WSUS sync was successful on our main primary. And then what we can see at the end of that log file, we now detect we have an additional replica WSUS server that we need to synchronize with our primary. So we'll see that it starts to synchronize the categories, and then it will go through and start synchronizing the updates. So at this point, it looks like things are good, but that initial sync can take about 30 minutes or so on average for a lab. So while that's running in the background, we'll go ahead and install the MP, DP, and the MP and DP. Now, one thing I might not have called out within that installation of the SUP, there is going to be within that proxy server, there is something called a connection account. So if you were using a server that was untrusted, the connection account would be the account that allows that WSUS server to connect to configure it. So if you had a WSUS in an untrusted domain, you would make sure that you entered credentials here that could connect to that remote WSUS server in order for us to configure it to tell it to point to our primary software update point internally for the sync. Okay. So moving back over to our machine, we're going to go ahead and add new site system roles on that DMZ or internet facing site system. And then we're going to do our MP and DP. So we're going to do the management point and the distribution point. I am going to choose to install and configure IIS if required. Now I did install it and I should have had all the components that I needed, but just in case, we can go ahead and install the additional IIS role services if we did miss something. We are going to configure the distribution point to use HTTPS because that's what we need for clients. And we're going to configure it to only use internet clients. So I'm going to have all my roles for MP, DP, and SUP to only allow connections from the internet. Now this certificate down here is actually a little bit confusing, so we don't actually need to import any certificate here for our distribution point. This would be if you were using HTTPS internally, you would want to make sure you import the distribution point cert, and that would be used for clients during operating system deployment to authenticate back to our MP and DP to get content and policy. Since internet clients would never be doing OSD, we don't really need to worry about inserting the distribution point cert. But this is something we do cover in the previous guide that we talked about for switching SCCM to HTTPS. Drive settings, I'm going to leave default. I did set up my no SMS on drive for my C drive, so that's going to force everything to install on the D drive. Not worried about a pool distribution point, not worried about Pixie, multicast, none of this would apply. Content validation, that won't apply. Now boundary groups, this is something that I do want to call out. For internet-based client management, the clients out on the internet are not boundary aware, so they actually don't use boundaries at all. So we can see here clients that connect for internet only communicate with site systems configured for internet only. But what we can see here is that, let me see if I can find it. All right, it took a minute to find what I wanted to show you. So internet clients do not support roaming. So what that means is they don't support any type of boundaries. So they can't determine what internet-facing site systems they should use based on speed or anything like that. Clients that are internet-facing will always communicate with a internet-facing site system, but they do that in a they don't do that in a type of way that allows you to specify which one to connect to, or it doesn't take any type of location or bandwidth into consideration. It would just randomly select one. So usually in most environments, you would probably just have one internet-facing site system anyways, but just note if you did have multiple, it would kind of be random with what internet clients choose when they talk to that initial site system. Okay. So we don't have to worry about any type of boundary groups for our server. We're going to configure our MP for HTTPS, and we are going to allow internet-only connections. Okay. All right. So this part, we're not going to use a replica, but the management point connection account could come into play if you were in a untrusted domain. In my case, I'm not, so that we can use the computer account of that remote site system to authenticate back to our SQL server running our primary site. But if you were in an untrusted domain, you would have to use a connection account that has SQL permissions to connect back to your primary site database for the MP to do things like content lookups against the database. Okay. And then next. We should already have our CcmMessaging.log open. Okay, so we can see in the site comp that it is currently installing the SMS management point. So if we go back to that folder for our logs on that remote site system, there should be a MPCERT.log that shows up. So this will give you more details about what's actually happening on that remote server. We can see that it did install successfully, so that looks good. We'll just wait a few minutes for that distribution point and all the other components to install, and we'll just monitor site comp to make sure everything looks good. All right, so I gave that a minute. Looks like all the components are now done. If we go back to the logs, I do want to check the mpcontrol.log on that remote system. And we want to make sure that it successfully checked for the management point availability. So we verified that it could in fact check and that the management point is up and listening on port 443. So that's a good sign. So what we should be able to do at this point as well is come to a client machine, and we can basically browse out to make sure that the web page is listening. So I should have the default IIS website just listening here. I don't have any type of filtering. So we can see we are in fact able to communicate from a client. So that's a good sign that we're able to access the server publicly as well. All right, let's go back to our WSync manager and just see what's going on there. Looks like that initial synchronization is still happening. So on the client side, once that switches over to the internet, it wouldn't actually give you the internet-facing software update point until we do have this first sync completely done. But what we should be able to do is over on our client, we can at least get it so it we can do some policy updates and try to get our internet-facing servers showing up in here. So if we look at the config manager properties in the control panel applet, this is where we can verify whether or not it does have a internet-based management point within the site. Now, you would expect that a policy update would usually bring this down. So if we came in here and actually ran a check, that will give us some information, but this property won't actually update until it does a new MPLIST check. So that's not quite as frequent as the policy is by default. So what I'm going to do to force this on the client is we'll restart the SMS exec and give that a couple minutes. But your clients would definitely get this within a couple hours or so when they do a MPLIST lookup to see if there are any new management points available. All right, so I just gave that service a minute to kick in. So what we can do to check whether that got the new management point for our internet machine is under client location, we should see that there's a new management point that becomes available. So that does look like it picked that up. So if we come back into our Configuration Manager applet, under network, we can now see that it does see that public fully qualified domain name for internet-based management point. So while we wait for that software update point to complete, what I am going to do is just verify that our distribution point is up and running for that remote site system we installed. So what I'll actually do is I'll distribute a application to it just to get that tested out to see whether we can distribute content. So I'm just going to add it directly here. You could use a boundary group if you wanted to add that management point or that distribution point to get content that we target to a group. That could certainly be another option here. So we'll give that a minute and we'll check. All right, so that content did go out. So our DP is working and functioning. We got the content out. It looks like we're still waiting on our software update point. We've got a couple more minutes before that first sync happens. So while we wait for that, I'll actually go a bit deeper into how we can verify that the management point is in fact functioning. So if you watched the PKI video, we actually talked about how we could do this, but I'll also show you how we can do this to check it on the internet side of things. So what I'm going to do is do a MPLIST lookup. Now this is really easy for sites that use HTTPS because they don't require client authentication. So it would just work by appending to the domain or the fully qualified website /SMS_MP/.SMS_AUT question MPLIST. And that would just show you a list of management points. Now with HTTPS, what we need is a client certificate. So we can basically simulate what a client would look like when it connects by importing a certificate into Internet Explorer. Now we did cover this in the PKI video, but what we've done here is we've already requested the distribution point certificate. And that certificate allows the private key to be exported because when we use the distribution point certificate, we export it with the private key and then we import it into our console. So then clients using OSD can authenticate because they have that private key when they're in WinPE to our site. But what we can also do with that certificate is import it into Internet Explorer if we want to run a quick test and enter the password that I used when I exported that. And then finish that. Now what that's going to allow us to do when we go and check this MPLIST, and we're even using that public name when we're checking it. This does require a internet restart. So if I close IE now that I imported that cert, and if we paste that in again. Now one thing I did notice is that with IE it does have a notification, but sometimes it shows in the backend. So what it's basically doing is the IIS server is saying that we require authentication. What certificate do you want to use? So this is the client certificate for our DP. We'll select that. And what that's going to allow us to do is basically validate that our management point is functioning, and it will list out the MPs within the site for internal communication. So this is coming from our internet-facing MP. So it is listening and it is functioning. We can notice that it doesn't have that internet-facing management point because that's not going to be advertised in the MPLIST checkup because it's internet facing, but this can validate that we are in fact listening. And we can also, to validate it again, there's also a MPCERT check that we can check to make sure that the management point has a cert and it is functioning and running. So just wanted to kill some time. I figured I'd kind of show you what that could look like if you did want to validate that using a client cert that you import into IE. So now that that's done, we're going to go ahead and remove that. But what that should do is validate that the management point is functioning and it would be able to serve clients because they have their client auth cert out on the internet. All right, so we are back. We can see that the replica synchronization did complete. So we should have that software update point all configured and completely synchronized and ready to take scans from clients. So what I'm going to do is we have a Windows 10 machine and it's currently on the intranet. So this is the machine that we were just looking at right here. We verified it got policy, it did an MP location lookup, and it does now have that internet facing management point in its policy and its list. So what we're going to do is go and configure that. And it's currently using, it's a VM, it's currently using a Ethernet adapter connect to my local network. But what we're going to do is switch that over to a wireless emulated switch that is connected to a guest network. So what that should do is eliminate access from this machine to have any type of communication with my domain. So it should then be considered a internet facing client when we do the switch here. Okay. So I'll just refresh this, make sure we still have internet. That looks good. Just to run a quick check, let's do a ping contoso.local. So that's my domain. Looks like we are offline from our network. So we'll ping SCCM3.contoso.local. So it looks like that guest network did do what we wanted it to do. So we're now can't communicate with our site at all. So what I'm going to do in my client logs, we're going to go look at client location. And we are going to look at location services. Now, one thing I did notice that is when we switch from our Hyper-V switch using the internal Ethernet to the Wi-Fi, that doesn't detect any type of network change on the client side. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and restart the SMS agent just so we can do a location request when we restart. Now, obviously, if a client were to connect to Wi-Fi, for example, if they were to be out on the internet, what would happen is the client would automatically detect that location change, and then it would see, it would switch over to the management point for the internet. So what we can see in Client.location.log is we can now see its domain joined, but it now says it's on the internet. So that did switch over, that network did switch it over, so it no longer detects that it's on our local network. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to look at the CcmMessaging.log. So the CcmMessaging.log, it's going to show us any type of HTTP request that is going to our site. So for example, what we can see here is we were previously talking to our internal management point. So we can see SCCM3.contoso.local. But when we switch that service over, what we can see is we now have new requests going in, and it's going into IBCM.setupconfigmanager.com. So we did switch over to the internet. We can verify we are getting good HTTP result codes when we're talking to our management point. The next thing I want to look at, I'm not sure if this has happened yet, but under WUAHandler, what that would do, that will show us when we switch to our internet-facing software update point. So it looks like there's not really much activity going there. I don't think this will switch over until we do a software update scan cycle. But what we can see is we are currently on the internet. And what we're going to do here is perform a software update scan cycle. And we can see that that scan cycle did in fact switch our client to the internet-facing software update point. So previously, I did clear the log file so we don't see any previous activity. It was pointing to that SCCM3.contoso.local. So it did switch it over automatically on the client side because we're now on the internet. So what it's going to do next, if we go and look at the ScanAgent.log, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Let me get that guy back over here. Looks like I wasn't passing my Windows key, so it snapped that over. So if we go back to our VM under ScanAgent, we can see that we're currently performing a full scan. So that's going against our internet-facing software update point. So I'll pause this while we wait for that to complete. All right, so we can see the scan was successful here. So if we zoom in, we can see the scan did perform. I do like going into a bit of details sometimes about what's actually happening on the back end. So what I've done on my software update point for my internet facing role, I've gone into the IIS log files for my default website. So this is the old WSUS website, and we moved that over. So we just look at the default folder here and then the log file. So we can see all the activity of the software update point syncing from our primary SCCM3 server. But what we're interested in is seeing this client actually communicate with IIS. So if we look down here, we can see the client right over here. It looks like it's using an IPv6 for my internet address. It's doing all these scans against the web service. So that's where we're doing our client scans. We can also see the client over here doing the different IIS post for the SCCM server as well. So for example, here's the CCM folders here that we're connecting with the IIS for. So that looks pretty good here. So jumping back over to my client, we do have a deployment targeting that. So what we can do is open up Software Center, and hopefully we can just verify that things are in fact working over the internet, like app deployment, for example. So if I come over here and click on install, we can see that all looks like it installed. Now, it might be common that you might run into some issues if things aren't quite working right for your internet clients. The first thing that we would look at is the CAS request. So we can see that in the CAS, that's the content requests that come in. That's going to be where we see whether or not we found the content. So here we go. We can see that request being made for that application for 7-zip. And we can see that it is pointing to our internet-facing distribution point. Now, to actually monitor the download, if something were to happen in the download, the data transfer service will actually show us when we're connecting in and downloading that content from our internet-facing distribution point. So that's where we can monitor that as well. Now, I did also target an update, so this might be an interesting one to walk through as well. What should happen in this scenario? Let me try to kick this off just to see if this will work. But the way updates work from Microsoft is they should, for internet clients, actually download from the internet, from Microsoft Update, because that makes sense, right? If they're already out on the internet, there'd be no purpose to come back into your environment to use bandwidth when that update is actually available. So here we can see for the internet client, we're actually pointing out to the Windows Update service. So we grab that update from there, and that's what we're actually going to download into our cache. Looks like the download has actually already happened, and now we're just verifying that it was installed, and it looks like that all works successfully. And I think that's all I was looking to cover. So I think we hit the main points. We set up IBCM, set up our SUP, DP, MP, verified the client could download an app and scan and install an update. I didn't cover the application catalog. That could potentially be a site system role that you could install. But since that's going to be deprecated, since we can now do user deployments natively in the new Software Center, I don't think that would really be too big of a deal to cover within this video. If you have any questions, this is a deep topic. If you have any DMZ, untrusted forest questions, hit me up on Twitter at ShelfontJustin. Leave a comment in the video and or blog post, and I'm more than happy to help with anything that you might be interested in getting answers for. Thank you for watching.